Hi everyone. In this video, I'm going to be explaining what I consider the three core problem areas or core problems of PTSD. As far as I can tell, all of the symptoms of PTSD can be traced back to one or more of these core problems. And so I kind of think of them like roof leaks. Like if you have a leaky roof, water comes in, and depending on how much water comes in for how long, it's going to potentially cause other issues. Some of those issues, if you fix the roof leak, will go away. So for example, exaggerated startle response, right? If you fix hypervigilance, exaggerated startle response goes away. On the other hand, something like sleep disturbance, while you're in the process of fixing hypervigilance and having a dysregulated nervous system, there are things that you could do to manage your sleep. And so that's an example of something that we actually could work on while we're fixing the roof leak, right? And then there are other problems that are going to require specific work. But the reason that I want to set all of this up as three core problem areas is, as far as I can tell, all the other symptoms stem from these core problems. And in the process of fixing these three problems, you basically kind of take care of everything else along the way. And so this is the best way that I've found to conceptualize what someone's doing when they're healing PTSD. They're basically working on these three, I call them problem areas. And that'll make more sense in a few minutes here in a little bit. But the first problem area I call disrupted physiology. And the first problem within this problem area is what I call overactive physiology. And that refers to having a dysregulated central nervous system. So basically, your fight or flight response, your sympathetic nervous system, is being triggered too frequently or too easily. You might also be in a situation where it's kind of just on all the time. So maybe you're not jumping to condition red like constantly, but maybe you're living in like condition yellow. And so one of the issues with that is that in opposition to your sympathetic nervous system is your parasympathetic nervous system, and that's known as your rest and digest system. And the sympathetic nervous system is like an emergency system. It's only supposed to turn on for emergencies. The rest of the time, you're supposed to be living in your parasympathetic nervous system. And so somebody that is living in their sympathetic nervous system is going to experience all kinds of physiological symptoms as a result of that. So for one, you're going to have a lot of issues with sleep. Because if your body's preparing for a fight or has already prepared for a fight, you're not going to be able to fall asleep. And if you wake up in the middle of the night, let's say you think you hear something, you hear a noise, right? That's going to trigger your adrenaline, that's going to trigger your sympathetic nervous system, and you're not going to be able to fall asleep, right? And so sleep issues are probably like one of the biggest symptoms of having a dysregulated central nervous system. The other big one being digestive issues, because when your sympathetic nervous system is activated, your digestion slows or stops. And so what ends up happening is people end up with constipation or diarrhea or irritable bowel syndrome. It seems to me, from personal experience and from other people that I know, that when your gut health is so thrown off, you're more susceptible to any existing sensitivities that you might have to something like being lactose intolerant or having a gluten intolerance, something like that, right? So maybe if your gut health was really healthy, like you could get away with some of that stuff a little bit more, but because your gut health is so bad, like it just kind of comes in and wrecks everything. So you're like heightened sensitivity, basically. And the way this is experienced in the body is really going to feel like anxiety, like panic, like your body is basically going into overdrive, right? It's going into fight or flight. I had the second problem in this problem area, which is alexithymia. And I always feel like I'm saying that word wrong, but alexithymia is emotional numbness. And if you have emotional numbness, you might have alexithymia. You might also be going into the fight, flight, or freeze, like the freeze aspect of that response, right? Because it's sometimes called fight, flight, or freeze response. And so that's going to be experienced more as like a shutting down, right? And so in some cases, people are going to experience the symptoms of trauma more as like detachment, indifference, numbness, depression, and it's going to kind of show up in not so much as stress. And that's why this is probably a good time to explain that I don't actually think that post-traumatic stress disorder is the most accurate term. Because if you took 100 people that were really struggling with trauma or the symptoms of trauma, some of them would characterize their symptoms as like stress, but a decent chunk of them wouldn't. And so by calling it post-traumatic stress disorder, it's kind of misleading to people that aren't informed. Now, if you're a therapist or someone more familiar with these issues, as you talk to those people, you might be able to discern that they're numbed out and that they do in fact have a dysregulated central nervous system. But all treatment begins with self-diagnosis for the most part. And so if we don't set people up that have experienced trauma to be able to easily identify the issues that they're experiencing, then we're doing them a disservice. And so I actually like to think of it as post-traumatic suffering disorder. And the cool thing about this little change is that it keeps the acronym the same, PTSD, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder, post-traumatic suffering disorder. And the reason that's cool is because we use words to point to things, right? So if I say table, you don't really know what kind of table I'm talking about. Could be an end table, dining room table, coffee table. But if I say round wooden coffee table, you know what I'm talking about. It's more specific, right? So we use words to point to ideas. And so the term PTSD, the way that most people use it, is to point to the collection of things that's gone wrong with a person as a result of experiencing trauma. And that's how most people use it. Most people don't really probably know the criteria from the DSM-5. They probably don't really know like the specific criteria. They just know that that's the term that we use to refer to like the collection of things that goes wrong with a person when they experience trauma. And so people can I can use PTSD, you can use PTSD, we can all keep using PTSD the same way. It's just know that when I say PTSD, I'm talking about post-traumatic suffering disorder. And I'm really hoping that this catches on because there are a lot of people out there that are struggling with the symptoms of trauma and they don't even realize it. And the reason they don't realize it is because they don't realize that it's symptoms of trauma that they're dealing with. They don't realize that that's the source of their suffering. And so that's that's kind of like the main reason I call it post-traumatic suffering disorder. It's more accurate and it enables people to more easily self-diagnose, which leads to them healing. And that's, really important. So that's why I call it post-traumatic suffering disorder. So the second problem area is what I call monuments of misery. And the idea here is that a monument of misery is the underlying event or memory or memories. There could be multiple monuments of misery, but it's the underlying event or memory that is behind or causing intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, and nightmares. And so most people know what nightmares, I'm assuming everyone knows what a nightmare is, right? Intrusive thoughts are basically if you find yourself randomly thinking about this thing and there's nothing that really reminded you of it and it was kind of inappropriate, like you're playing with your kids or you're at the beach or you're making love to your spouse and all of a sudden you're thinking about this horrible thing and you're like, oh, why am I thinking about this right now? That's an intrusive thought. Flashbacks are experienced on a continuum. So like when I first got back from Afghanistan, I didn't even realize I was having flashbacks because they were kind of like one of the more milder versions of it where I was basically just laying in bed for like hours at a time at night, awake, just kind of like replaying like every single significant event over and over and over again in my head. But I didn't lose sense of like where I was or any of that, which is like the more extreme versions of flashbacks. And that's kind of the versions that we tend to think about because that's what we see portrayed in a movie, right? But for a person experiencing flashbacks, like I said, they can be on a continuum. So they might be a more mild version where you're just remembering really hard and you're replaying the whole thing over and over, right? And that's a version of a flashback. And in each of these three instances, what's happening is the unconscious mind is projecting this memory back into our field of conscious awareness in an effort to get us to deal with it. And so what we have to do is we have to confront our monuments of misery, we have to make sense of them, and we have to do what I think of it as converting them to wells of wisdom. And so I know it's kind of like odd terminology, like why are you calling it a monument of misery and a well of wisdom? It's like, well, it's a monument of misery because I needed a term for the underlying event or memory that's kind of behind intrusive thoughts, nightmares, and flashbacks, right? And it made sense to call it a monument of misery because it's like, imagine the Statue of Liberty was like 10 times bigger than it is, and you lived anywhere near it. Like anywhere you went pretty much, well, unless there was like really tall buildings. So maybe the Statue of Liberty is a bad example, but the idea is that it's always there as a reminder of your misery and of the misery of the world, no matter where you go, right? Because it's like you're constantly being reminded of it, right? And then it's a well of wisdom because in order to get them to go away, or I should say in order to get the intrusive thoughts, nightmares, and flashbacks to go away, you have to make sense of the event, right? And you can't like pretend it didn't happen. So you can't make it go away. So you have to convert it to something. And if it's not a monument of misery, it needs to be something basically that doesn't have, you need to get rid of all the emotional charge so you're not really reactive to it. You need to make sense of it. And there's a couple other things you need to do. And I have a video that I'm going to do about the 4 ways to process traumatic memories. But basically you have to turn it into an event that you got a lot of wisdom out of and you continue to get wisdom out of, because it's a window to understanding the human experience. It's a window to understanding yourself, people, evil, all these different things, right? And so that's how I like to think of it. And what's kind of cool is, and I didn't do this on purpose, but the acronym for Monument of Misery is MOM, and the acronym for Well of Wisdom is WOW. And so if you flip MOM upside down, you get WOW, which is what we're doing. We're trying to invert them, right? We're trying to take this negative experience and turn it into something that's at least like maybe kind of positive in some way. And I'll talk more about that in a future video. The other good thing to know about monuments of misery is that they exist at different levels of abstraction. So you could have a monument of misery that is kind of like war, right? Or why were my parents so bad to me? Or how could people do that? It's kind of like it's a more abstract level, right? And then you might have, so that might be like part of the monument of misery or one monument of misery, but then you might have like a specific event that happened that's another monument of misery that you kind of have to deal with. And so you might find yourself thinking about having intrusive thoughts and dwelling on these things and feeling really shitty about them, but not realizing that you are thinking about your trauma because maybe it's something kind of vague. Maybe you're thinking like, how is my mother such a bad person? Or how could, so-and-so do that to me, or something like that, right? And it doesn't, it's related, obviously related, but it might not be immediately obvious that it's related. So the third problem area is moral injury. And this one is like kind of easy to explain, but I think for a lot of people it's going to be hard to actually really understand like how big of a deal this one is, because in my opinion, this is the hardest part of PTSD to fix. And in some ways it's the most insidious. And so I really like this definition of moral injury from this study. Moral injury, originally discussed in relationship to transgressing moral beliefs and values during wartime among military personnel, has expanded beyond this context to include similar emotions experienced by healthcare professionals, first responders, and others experiencing moral emotions resulting from actions taken or observations made during traumatic events or circumstances. The way I came to understand moral injury is it was kind of somewhat early on in my journey, and I was realizing that one of the problems that I was dealing with was that I just didn't trust reality. It's like I was always waiting for something bad to happen. And I think the common term for it is a sense of impending doom. And one night I was reading Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, and I came across this passage, and a light bulb went on, and I realized that this is one of my issues, right? And I would eventually reframe this passage to just be three relationships, right? The relationship that you have with yourself, the relationship that you have with people/humanity, because it exists at different levels, and the relationship that you have with reality/God, however you want to think about that. Because even if you're an atheist, you still have a relationship with reality. And so what do I mean by relationship? Well, like a relationship, you have a relationship with a lot of different things. You have a relationship maybe with your job, with the school you went to, the house you live in, the car you drive, all these different things. We have a relationship with them, right? And a relationship is just the way we interact with something. It's the way we feel about something. It's a story we tell ourselves about something. It is the way we think about something. And so a lot of it, though, it's a lived experience, right? It's felt as an experience and lived as an experience more than really anything else. And it really becomes our reality. Like it defines our reality. And so I actually think of an analogy I like to use is if you've ever like put on sunglasses and then you forgot you were wearing them, and you're like, pick them up and you're like, whoa, like the world looks completely different, right? And you're like, how did I not realize I was wearing sunglasses? And it's because your mind adjusts, and it really only picks up interval. So anything that's like steady and normal and constant kind of just fades into the background, right? And so with moral injury, the way that you see the world is damaged. The way that you see people is damaged. The way that you see yourself is damaged. All those things are damaged. All those relationships define your entire experience as a human being, basically, right? Because the relationship that you have with yourself is going to determine how you live your life, how you take care of yourself, what you aspire to, what kind of life you have, all those different things, right? Your relationship with people. Well, that people and the way we interact with them in those relationships constitute a massive portion of our lives, right? Of significant experience. And then reality, well, that's everything. And so that's your, like, literally that's existence itself. Like that's your experience as a human being. And so it's everything. And I like to think of it as like, you basically have put on shit colored lenses, and most people don't realize that they have them on, because especially if you were traumatized as a child, because you never had a chance to establish like a normal view of the world, right? And so if you were traumatized when you were 4, 5, 7, 10, 15, whatever, like it's going to be way harder for you to heal this because you don't have a baseline to return to. And if you're traumatized as a child, it's going to like completely kind of mess with the way that you see people in the world, because you're forming your opinions, you're forming your beliefs, your core beliefs about the world and about people and yourself. And so if you're traumatized as a kid, like it just completely knocks the legs out from under people. Like it just really like, it really damages people, and especially people that are victims of child abuse. Like it makes it, like, as my one friend put it, damn hard to live a normal life. And it's this moral injury that really is, I would argue, probably like one of the, like the main issue really with that. Because I mean, look, you can have monuments of misery. You can be dealing with, intrusive thoughts, nightmares and flashbacks. You can be dealing with a dysregulated central nervous system. But if you don't care about yourself, because what happens is the relationship with yourself is damaged too. And so victims of child abuse often feel like they were willing participants, or they deserved it, or it's a reflection of their value as a human being. Victims of rape also often carry around feelings of guilt and shame. Combat veterans, even if we conduct ourselves in the most honorable way, when you're engaged in combat and you're killing other human beings, you engage with parts of yourself that make you feel kind of gross. And so that also damages the relationship that you have with yourself. And so if you think of yourself as a bad, shitty person, and that also happens because if you think of people as bad, and then now you're a person too, right? So that means you're bad now too. And so why would you want anything good for yourself? And this is like really one of the main impediments why people with PTSD don't heal, is they simply, I'm not saying they don't want it. I'm saying they believe that they don't deserve it. And that might not be a conscious belief. Like if you ask them, do you think you deserve to have a happy life? They might say yes. You might say yes. But you want to ask yourself the question, do I deserve to be happy? And see how you feel, and see how you answer that question to yourself, because you might be surprised. And so in the next video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the criteria for PTSD from the DSM-5, and that's kind of like the most widely used diagnostic criteria for PTSD. And I'm going to do it for two reasons. One, I want to explain all of the other downstream symptoms and give you examples and help you understand how these other problems affect a person, and how these other problems, like what the downstream symptoms look like. And so the DSM criteria is a pretty comprehensive list of symptoms. And so it's pretty effective as a tool in that regard. The other thing I want to do is kind of explain how all of those symptoms stem from these three core problem areas, so that you actually believe me when I say that these are in fact the three core problems. And that's not to say that you might not have other issues that you need to work on. It's just like, if you're healing PTSD, like these are the three things you're working on, right? Like if you're getting in shape, you're exercising, you're managing your nutrition, and you're managing your recovery, like sleep and hydration, supplements, whatever. Well, maybe that would be nutrition, but you get the idea, right? Like if you're working out, those are the three things that you're doing, right? If you're quote unquote getting in shape, and everything that you do is going to pretty much fall into one of those three categories. This is a little different because these are problems that we're addressing as opposed to like categories of things that we're doing. But the idea is the same thing. It's basically, the idea is the same though. It's like, these are the three things that you're fixing. And if you focus on these three things, you will make progress. And so hopefully you guys are finding this useful. Thanks for watching.